I had always imagined my wedding as a quiet, intimate celebration on our family farm. The kind of day where the sun kissed the rolling fields and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. We were planning a rustic, farm-style ceremony, local flowers, DIY decor, and a meal made from food sourced right here on the property. It was going to be simple, but perfect. The farm had always been a part of me, and I couldn't think of a better place to say, I do. Everything was coming together smoothly, just the way I had dreamed it. But then, as I started finalizing the last few details, I got a knock on the door. It was Karen, the HOA president, and if you've ever had the displeasure of dealing with someone like her, you know it's never good news. She walked in with that all-too-familiar smile, the kind that only comes when someone thinks they have the upper hand. "Your wedding," she started, "isn't approved by the HOA." Of course, my heart sank. Here I was trying to put together the most special day of my life, and Karen had to step in and ruin it. She started listing off all these ridiculous rules that, apparently, meant I couldn't use my own property the way I wanted. Apparently, it wasn't enough that I had worked hard to make this farm my home. Now I had to deal with HOA regulations dictating how my wedding would go down. Karen didn't waste any time getting to the point. She marched into the wedding planning with a sense of entitlement I'd never seen before. "This wedding," she started, flipping through her clipboard like she was reading from some HOA manual, "doesn't meet community standards." I blinked, feeling my frustration rising. She continued without even letting me speak. "There can't be any farm equipment visible. We need the chairs rearranged. And absolutely no animals. They're not appropriate for an event like this." I stared at her, trying to keep my calm. This was my wedding, on my land, but somehow Karen believed she had the authority to tell me how to run things. She rattled off demands like she was in charge of everything. "You'll need to change the flower colors. Bright ones are too bold. We prefer pastel tones, something more neutral. And these seating arrangements? We'll need to move a few to fit the approved layout." It was clear that nothing I had planned was going to meet her standards. And of course, she had an opinion on everything. The flowers? Wrong. The chairs? Wrong. The music? You guessed it, wrong. She even went as far as suggesting that I hire her preferred vendors. "I know a great catering team and an excellent florist. You should really give them a call," she said, with that familiar smug look, as if she had the power to dictate every detail. The wedding planners and even some of the other vendors she recommended were caught in the middle. She had already pressured them into changing their setups to meet her vision. One of the florists had to redo the entire bouquet just to fit Karen's approved shades. The caterer, who had been excited to prepare a menu that matched the rustic vibe of the farm, was now forced to swap out half the menu for more formal options. I was torn. Part of me wanted to scream, tell her to back off, and let me have my day in peace. But another part of me wanted to avoid the hassle, keep things calm, and make sure I could still marry the love of my life without turning the whole thing into a battle. Every time I opened my mouth to stand up for myself, Karen would shoot me down with that fake sweetness. "It's for the community, you know," she'd say. "We all want it to be perfect." But in reality, it was only perfect for her. The more she got involved, the more I felt like my dream wedding was slipping away, piece by piece. I didn't want to make a scene, but it was hard not to. I was losing control of something that was supposed to be mine. Despite all the pressure, I kept my frustration inside, hoping I could somehow get through this without making waves. But deep down, I knew Karen was overstepping, and something had to give. The day of the wedding finally arrived, and I was already feeling the weight of Karen's interference hanging over me. The ceremony was supposed to be everything I had dreamed of, a peaceful, beautiful moment shared with close family and friends. But instead, it felt like I was walking into a minefield of HOA rules and regulations. The moment Karen showed up, I knew things were going to get worse. She was there bright and early, clipboard in hand, ready to oversee every detail. She hovered over the caterers, the florists, and even the sound crew, making sure everything was up to code. The wedding planners seemed exhausted, their faces tight as they tried to keep things on track, but it was clear that Karen's presence was a cloud hanging over the entire event. At one point, she even started directing the guests, telling them where to sit and when to arrive, as if she was the one running the show. I was about to lose it. This wasn't her wedding, it was mine. But there she was, acting like she had the final say in everything. I stepped aside for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. My partner and I exchanged glances, and I could tell they were just as frustrated as I was. We had worked so hard to make this day special, but with Karen's constant meddling, it felt like we were losing all the joy that should come with it. That's when the idea hit me. I didn't have to just stand there and let her ruin it all. If Karen thought she could control everything, then maybe it was time to let the animals do the talking. I glanced over at the barn where the cows were grazing, their large bodies calmly moving through the field. A grin tugged at my lips. My cows had always been a little unpredictable, a bit rowdy at times, but they were part of the farm's charm. Why not let them be the stars of the day? I knew it wasn't the most conventional plan, but at that moment, it felt like the perfect way to regain control. I wasn't going to let Karen's overbearing attitude ruin my wedding. If she was going to step in and take charge, I was going to give her a taste of what it really meant to lose control. So, with a quiet smile, I pulled out my phone and called the farmhand. "Open the back gate," I said, my voice barely containing the excitement. "Let them out. All of them." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a chuckle. "All of them? You sure?" "Oh, I'm sure," I replied, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. As the gate creaked open, I knew things were about to get interesting. It didn't take long for the cows to make their grand entrance. Within minutes of the back gate swinging open, they charged onto the wedding grounds, like a herd of uninvited guests at a party no one knew they were coming to. First, it was the slow, methodical pacing of the cows as they made their way toward the tables. Some wandered into the seating area, bumping into chairs and scattering guests who hadn't quite processed what was happening. Others, particularly the younger cows, were more energetic, trotting around with wide eyes, chewing on whatever they could find, mostly the flowers and decorations that had been painstakingly set up. The sound of hooves against the grass was almost rhythmic, like a drumbeat setting the tone for what was to come. The guests froze, unsure whether to laugh or scream. I saw one of the bridesmaids clutch her bouquet a little tighter, clearly trying to hold it together, but there was no denying the amusement written across her face. And then, just as I had hoped, one of the bulls, named Diesel, spotted the wedding cake. This bull had a reputation for being a bit of a troublemaker, and it was clear he wasn't about to disappoint. With one swift move, Diesel made a beeline for the table where the beautifully decorated cake stood. The guests shrieked in horror, but there was nothing they could do to stop him. The impact was swift and brutal. Diesel's massive head crashed into the cake, knocking it over in a pile of frosting and shattered layers. The bride, who had been blissfully unaware until this moment, let out a loud gasp and dashed forward, but it was too late. The cake was gone, and in its place was a mess of cake, frosting, and a bull enjoying his newly found snack. Meanwhile, the other cows continued their chaotic rampage. One of them knocked over a chair, sending it toppling over with a loud crash. Another mooed loudly, just as if it was cheering on the destruction. Guests scattered, some running for cover, others standing frozen in disbelief. The air was thick with confusion, laughter, and the occasional scream as the cows did their best to explore every inch of the wedding setup. The situation only got worse when the goats decided they needed to join in on the fun. A particularly feisty goat darted across the yard, leaping onto the gift table, scattering wrapped presents everywhere. Another goat made a bold decision to climb onto the DJ's sound system, stomping on the controls and warping the classical wedding music into a cacophony of distorted, off-key sounds. The bride's mother stood there, her mouth agape, not knowing whether to yell or laugh at the absurdity of the moment. And then my favorite troublemaker, Sergeant Honkers, the goose, decided it was time to assert his dominance. With a loud honk, he waddled across the lawn, flapping his wings in full force, and headed straight for the groom. The poor guy barely had time to react before Sergeant Honkers made a beeline for his legs, pecking at him and flapping wildly as if trying to chase him off his own land. The groom, looking completely flustered, tried to fight the goose off, but it was clear that he was losing the battle. Karen, standing near the chaos, was beside herself. Her face changed color from confusion to disbelief, and finally to pure rage. She looked at me, eyes wide and mouth agape, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "What did you do?" she screeched. I couldn't help it. I smiled, leaning casually against the buffet table as if I were watching the world's best reality show. "Looks like my cows didn't get the wedding invite," I said with a shrug, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle unfolding before me. The cows, of course, couldn't care less about Karen's wedding. They were on a mission to explore, munch, and generally disrupt anything they came across. The chaos was now in full swing, and Karen was powerless to stop it. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. For once, it wasn't me who was at the mercy of someone else's rules. It was Karen. The chaos only escalated as Karen's carefully planned event spiraled into complete mayhem. Guests were frantically trying to escape the cows, some scrambling to avoid getting knocked over by the massive bodies wandering through the seating area. Others were attempting to salvage whatever decorations they could, but it was no use. The cows had done their job, and the wedding was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Karen, who had spent the past several weeks micromanaging every detail of this event, was now completely helpless. She marched through the wreckage, waving her arms like a conductor trying to orchestrate a symphony, but the cows had no interest in following her cues. She yelled, "Everyone stay calm. The cows will go away soon." But there was no calming anyone down. One of the older guests, clearly trying to avoid stepping in any cow-related mess, had taken refuge behind the catering table, clutching his drink like it was the last thing he would ever own. Another guest, who'd gotten too close to one of the cows, let out a loud cry as he slipped in fresh manure, his expensive shoes forever ruined. His companions could only stare in shock as he tried to scrape the mess off, looking more defeated than anyone else at the event. Karen's face was turning a deep shade of red now, a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She shot me a look that could have burned a hole in the ground. "You did this on purpose," she shrieked, her voice shrill and panicked. I simply shrugged, popping a shrimp from the buffet table into my mouth. "They live here," I said casually. "You're the one who decided to throw a wedding on my land without asking." Karen's eyes went wide as she tried to make sense of the situation. "You're ruining everything. You're ruining my reputation. This wedding was supposed to be a huge deal, and now look." She waved her hands at the disaster unfolding around us. Cows grazing on the flowers, a goat climbing the DJ's sound system, and the wedding cake being devoured by Diesel, the bull. The bride, now fully hysterical, had started sobbing uncontrollably, clutching what was left of her bouquet like it was her only connection to the wedding that could have been. The groom was still trying to fight off Sergeant Honkers, who seemed to have decided the groom's shiny suit was the perfect target for a little battle. "I'm calling the police," Karen shrieked, her voice rising above the sounds of panic and mayhem. She turned to the wedding guests, trying to rally them against me. "This is criminal. They're trespassing on my wedding." But by this point, the guests weren't having it. Some were snapping photos, some were laughing nervously, and others were simply too stunned to do anything but watch the absurdity unfold. Karen, who had once held herself with such authority, was now completely out of control. It was clear that whatever illusion of power she'd once had was quickly crumbling. I leaned back, enjoying the show. It was hard not to. Karen, once so sure of herself, was now grasping at straws, trying to salvage what was left of her precious wedding. It felt good to finally see her so flustered. The same woman who had insisted on controlling every aspect of my life just because she didn't like the way I ran my property. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse for Karen, another cow, clearly enjoying the party, strolled casually over to the drink station and knocked over the entire table of champagne glasses. Expensive bubbly spilled everywhere, mixing with the dirt and remnants of the ruined cake. The guests gasped, and I almost felt bad for them. Almost. Karen, meanwhile, was frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing like she had forgotten how to speak. But that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just watch Karen flounder in the chaos. She had to realize just how deep of a hole she was in. "What did you do?" she snapped at me, her voice full of venom. But there was no question in my mind about how this was all going to end. She'd gotten exactly what she deserved. She had overstepped, ignored my rights, and now it was her turn to face the consequences. I wiped my mouth with a napkin, glanced over at her once more, and said with a grin, "Looks like your wedding's going a little off track, Karen." By now, Karen had completely lost her composure. She was standing in the middle of the yard, her once pristine outfit covered in frosting and dirt, her face flushed with rage and embarrassment. The wedding, which she had planned to perfection, was now a scene of utter chaos. The cows had made sure of that. I stood back, watching with a sense of quiet satisfaction as the cows continued to wreak havoc. One of them, clearly enjoying the attention, decided to sit down right in the middle of the seating area, blocking several rows of guests who were trying to flee the madness. Another cow, having spotted the table of gifts, started nibbling on the ribbons, tearing through the carefully wrapped presents. But the real fun came when Diesel, the bull, decided he wasn't done yet. He had moved away from the cake, but now he was standing near the dance floor, pawing at the ground like he was about to charge. Guests scattered in all directions, one woman clutching her dress and running to the farthest corner of the yard, another shrieking as she tried to avoid getting run over by the enormous animal. Karen was shouting at everyone to stay calm and don't make a scene, but her commands fell on deaf ears. The guests were too busy trying to avoid the chaos her precious wedding had become. At this point, it wasn't just about the cows anymore. It was about Karen's complete loss of control. I spotted a few of the more self-aware guests, who were now snapping pictures of the scene, their phones raised as they caught the moment. The bride, who had stopped crying, was now staring at the wreckage, her makeup smudged and her veil hanging in tatters. She was laughing, though it was a nervous laugh, realizing that no matter how much money had been spent on this event, it was beyond saving now. But Karen, still trying to save face, turned back to me, her voice trembling with anger. "You're doing this on purpose. You've ruined everything. My career, my reputation. It's all gone because of you." I couldn't help but smile, leaning casually against the buffet table, watching the last vestiges of Karen's perfect wedding slip through her fingers. "I didn't do anything," I said, my voice smooth and calm. "I'm just letting the cows enjoy the party." Karen's face twisted in fury, but I could see the truth dawning on her. There was no turning back now. The wedding was ruined, and she had no one to blame but herself. She had come into my life, tried to control what was mine, and now she was reaping the consequences. And just when I thought things couldn't get any better, one last surprise arrived. Sergeant Honkers, my trusty goose, waddled into the scene like the cherry on top of this disaster. He honked loudly, flapping his wings like he was claiming victory, and charged straight for the groom again. This time, the groom didn't even try to fight him off. He just stood there, staring at the goose with wide eyes, helplessly backing away. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and I loved every second of it. Karen was losing control with every passing minute, and the guests, though horrified at first, were now laughing and even filming the mess as it all went down. As I looked around at the madness, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. Karen had done everything in her power to control what was mine, but now she was the one who had to deal with the mess she'd created. The cows, the goats, and even Sergeant Honkers had given her exactly what she deserved: pure, unfiltered chaos. I stepped back and took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction of the moment sink in. The cows had stolen the show, and in the process, they had brought down Karen's world of control and manipulation. It was a sweet, sweet victory. As the chaos slowly started to die down, the guests began to gather their things, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others still chuckling at the madness they had just witnessed. The bride, her face streaked with mascara, had stopped sobbing and was now simply staring at the wreckage, a defeated smile on her lips. The groom was dusting himself off, trying to regain some sense of dignity, though he didn't have much left after the goose incident. Karen, on the other hand, was still in the middle of the yard, frozen in place, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was trying to regain control, but there was no going back. The damage had been done. Her once pristine wedding had turned into a disaster, and there was no way to fix it now. I took a moment to look around at the scene, feeling a strange sense of peace. Despite everything that had gone wrong, this was the wedding I'd always wanted. It was chaotic, yes, but it was also full of laughter, memories, and, most importantly, freedom. No one could control us here, not Karen, not the HOA, and certainly not anyone who thought they could tell us how to live our lives. Karen finally turned toward me, her face twisted in rage, but there was no more power in her words. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll make sure you pay for this." I raised an eyebrow and crossed my arms, unfazed. "You've already tried. You just got a taste of your own medicine, Karen. This wedding was about us, about our love, our family, and our farm. You couldn't control that, no matter how hard you tried." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but before she could get another word out, the sound of police sirens broke through the air, signaling the arrival of the law. I couldn't help but smirk, knowing that the final nail in her coffin had arrived. The police officers stepped out of their car, surveying the scene with a raised eyebrow. "Ma'am," one of them said, addressing Karen, "what seems to be the problem here?" Karen, still trying to salvage some dignity, turned to the officers, pointing at me. "He let his animals loose. They ruined my wedding. I'm calling for him to be arrested." The officers glanced at me, then back at the chaos unfolding around them. It was clear that Karen's story wasn't holding up. "This is private property?" one of the officers asked. "Yep," I said, giving a quick nod. "And no one had permission to host a wedding here." The officer turned to Karen, his expression neutral but firm. "Ma'am, it looks like you've got some explaining to do." Karen's face drained of color as the officers began asking her questions. She stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but there was no denying what had happened. With the guests and the bride's family now starting to distance themselves from her, Karen's once iron grip on the situation had slipped entirely. "Do you have permission to host this event?" one of the officers asked, his voice calm but stern. "No," Karen replied, her voice trembling. But the officer wasn't interested in her excuses. He pulled out his notebook and started writing down notes. "We'll need to take this up at the station. For now, we need you to come with us." The crowd gasped as the officers led Karen toward the patrol car, her protests growing more desperate by the second. She tried to argue, but her words were drowned out by the sound of the sirens as the police car drove away, taking her with it. The remaining guests, seeing that the situation was finally under control, started to leave, some heading for their cars, others chatting quietly as they made their way out. The bride and groom, looking shell-shocked but somehow relieved, exchanged a few words with me. The bride, wiping away the last of her tears, offered a weak smile. "Thank you," she said, though there was a hint of guilt in her voice. "I didn't know this wasn't allowed. If I had, I never would have." I waved it off, cutting her off. "No hard feelings. You didn't know what Karen was up to. But you've got a hell of a story to tell now, don't you?" She laughed, a genuine sound this time, despite the mess. "I guess we do." I nodded, watching them head to their car, still shaking their heads in disbelief. It had been a chaotic day, but in the end, it felt like a win. As I turned back to the farm, I couldn't help but smile. The cows had done their part, and so had I. The farm was mine, and no one was going to take that from me. Not Karen, not the HOA, and certainly not anyone who thought they could control me. A few days later, I got a message from one of the HOA members. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight. Karen is losing control. Thought you'd like to know." I smiled to myself. Things were far from over, but I was ready. Whatever Karen tried next, I'd be ready for it. This time, she had messed with the wrong person. And I was already looking forward to seeing how her fall from grace would play out.